Now, gentlemen, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Gavaskar, to you first. You yourself have spoken out about the Lodha recommendations recently. First up, I would like to ask you, what was your first impression initially when you heard what the Lodha recommendations were?
I had no impressions to speak of because I actually have no idea what's going on, or I should say I've got very little idea of what's going on between BCCI and Lodha. The communication there is between BCCI and the Lodha panel. I'm not privy to that communication.
All right, now, Mr. Gavaskar, some are saying that this is perhaps the biggest crisis that the BCCI has ever faced in their history, and that the BCCI perhaps are cornered right now. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think from what I've read in the papers today about the recommendations, yes, I think the BCCI finds itself in a difficult spot. But I think we all have to accept that at the end of the day, the Supreme Court is the final authority. So the BCCI will just have to wait and see what the Supreme Court decides in the first week of October.
All right, let's take that same thing to Aakash Chopra now. Aakash, good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, very strong words really used by Justice Thakur today when the Lodha panel report was placed in front of him. In fact, if I could quickly quote one statement of his, he said, "We had been anticipating such disregard from the board." It almost sounds like a last warning to me.
Well, it could be the last warning. Obviously, we are again reading between the lines, but then there is a review petition that was sent back because of some technical stuff. It will again be put up, I'm sure, in front of the same bench of the Supreme Court, and there will be some amount of hearing. See, from a cricketer's standpoint, what Mr. Gavaskar has said is absolutely right. The Chief Justice of India and the Supreme Court are the final authorities when it comes to a case to be debated upon. But as a cricketer, I look at the Lodha panel, I look at why it all started and what actually has transpired. One thing really stands out. It started with the allegation of betting and gambling and match fixing. And that was one thing that was sent to the parliament. So for that particular thing, the Lodha panel has recommended that let's have a legislature, so get the parliament involved. But for everything else, there has been a recommendation on how the board should conduct its business. There are quite a few things that have irked people like Sunny Bhai or Kapil Dev, the great Kapil Dev. They have all spoken about things that are perhaps not in line with what it should be when you come to managing a sport like cricket in India, which is, let's be honest, it's been managed fairly well as compared to all the other sports put together. So there are things that do stand out when you look at this Lodha panel and their recommendations.
Absolutely. Let me take that to Mr. Kishore Bhimani now. Mr. Bhimani, good to have you back on NDTV. Good evening. Now, we might be talking about cricket administration here, Mr. Bhimani, but what really makes me smile is that this is turning into a game of tennis almost. The ball is on one day in the BCCI's court, and the next day it's in the Lodha panel's court. Now the ball back in the BCCI's court. October 6th is the next hearing when the Supreme Court will take up this matter. What kind of a response really are you expecting from the Indian Cricket Board?
Aakash, just one thing. May I comment very briefly on what Aakash Chopra just said? Now, it's not fair to say that this all began with just match fixing and betting allegations. There were much bigger issues involved. The president of the board, the former president of the board, Mr. Srinivasan, was found to be guilty of a lot of conflict of interest. There was an attempt at cover-up when it involved Gurunath Mayappan. There were a whole lot of issues which engaged the two panels, and Justice Lodha came to the conclusion, after plenty of good thinking and good counsel, that what was happening perhaps was not good for cricket. It may have been good for BCCI. The point at issue, I really believe, Aakash, is that this idea of board of control, whom they believe they can control everything, they have done so far. For the first time, you mentioned something about whether this is the biggest crisis. Of course it is. The very existence of the president, the secretary and the board is in balance. Today, they are being questioned by the Supreme Court of the land, which says that, have you been doing anything for cricket? That what is this all about? Is this a power game? Is this a money game? Is this a cover-up game? Is this conflict of interest acceptable? And this is what has done this. And where we go from here to 6th October, you know, not so much a tennis game as an attempt at survival. Today they brought in Markandeya Kajju, a former justice and a wonderful human being must be, but he was brought in to take on the Supreme Court. Right. Instead of these people buckling down, instead of Anurag Thakur and Mr. Ajay Shirke buckling down and saying, let us take what the advice of the justice is, instead of that, they said, brought in Markandeya Kajju. They questioned the very lot of the recommendations given, and they questioned that a person can be biased. Right. I mean, how many people in this country have the nerve to call the Chief Justice biased and get away with it? I mean, this is all wrong. Today, if it is a tennis game, it is game, set and match for the Supreme Court.
All right, game, set and match then for the Supreme Court, says Mr. Kishore Bhimani. Aakash, I want to take that same thing to you. One of the very important points that Mr. Bhimani brought up, that review petition which you yourself also talked about, and that was of course on the advice of Justice Kajju that the BCCI filed, and they went ahead in fact with their 87th annual general meeting where they appointed the selectors and they took other decisions on the basis of that review petition. Do you individually think that that was perhaps a bad call?
Well, hindsight is perfect vision. You can look back and see things the way you want to see, and then just make a head or tail of it. See, there are a few things. Obviously, Mr. Bhimani has also mentioned a few things, and you've been talking about something as well. How many cricketers do we have in that Lodha panel is something that we need to absolutely know. And because some of the recommendations that we talk about, who decides and how do you decide that 3 selectors are the right things to actually, like, having 3 selectors will solve all the problems. What if all 3 selectors actually come from the same zone? Who selects them? That is one. And why 3 years and not 5? Because the President or Prime Minister of India is given a 5-year term. Why a 3-year term and not a 2.5 or a 4.5-year term? See, these are recommendations made by a few individuals. Of course, nobody is above law. Nobody is. I'm not even blaming somebody to being biased. But it's just about making those informed opinions, informed calls. You've got a state having 3 teams, but the state having only 1 vote. There are issues that need addressing and it need discussing. Whether that discussion will happen or not, I'm not a legal. I cannot tell you whether it will happen or not. But right. It should have happened, and it should happen in the benefit of the sport in this country. For example, a players' body, yes, of course, have it. Why not? And I'm sure BCCI would want to have it. We spoke about the conflict of interest as well. There is an ombudsman already in place. So all the conflict of interest cases are already going to him. So that one thing is already been set right. So there are things that have been set right. There are things that will eventually should be set right. But to just paint them with the same brush that everything is wrong, I don't think it's black or white. There's a lot of area of grey.
Absolutely. I don't think anyone in this country will stand up and say that cricket administration is completely down in the dumps in this country. As Aakash, you yourself mentioned that perhaps the BCCI and the way cricket is run in India, 8 out of 10 things might be very, very good. But at the end of the day, what we cannot refute is that majority of these recommendations were upheld by the Supreme Court itself. And the BCCI still went ahead and defied a number of those recommendations when they did hold their AGM and passed Ajay Shirke's nomination as secretary, appointed their new selection committee. Let's take that to Mr. Gavaskar now. Mr. Gavaskar, the Chief Justice of India, Justice Thakur, has used rather strong words. He in fact said the BCCI thinks it is a law unto itself and we know how to get our orders implemented. The BCCI says on one day that it will comply with all the recommendations. On the other hand, another day, they go ahead and defy a few of those recommendations. Is the Indian Cricket Board, sir, coming across as being rather stubborn?
Well, again, what the circumstances were at the annual general meeting is something that, somebody who was there at the meeting will be able to tell you as to I understand that the panel had recommended that conduct business that takes into account the year 2015-16 and don't do any business that looks into 2016-17. So yes, I think the appointment of a new selection committee to look into 2016-17 was surprising. And I suppose, that's the kind of thing that has riled the Supreme Court. And therefore, we are hearing what we are hearing at the moment. So I would imagine that, yes, I think at least as far as that is concerned, the selection committees that were formed for junior as well as the senior selection committees, maybe that could have been avoided, because after all, if it was going to be something that was going to be done by the month of November, I think then the Supreme Court and the Lodha panel wouldn't have been upset.
Right. So, Mr. Gavaskar, they're saying that maybe the BCCI would have made a wise decision if they did not appoint the selection committee. That, of course, defied one of the Lodha panel recommendations, because they could have done this only if they had accepted the recommendations before they held their annual general meeting. Talking about the recommendations, Mr. Bhimani, are we even completely clear, 100% clear about what recommendations the BCCI is okay with and which recommendations they're completely against? Because I was almost sure that they were okay with the 70-year age cap recommendation, but someone like Mr. Sharad Pawar is still president of the Mumbai Cricket Association.
Well, I suppose in the interim, everyone is taking advantage of the fact what has not been. But to come to your very, very interesting and a very useful point, which recommendations are they at home with? Which they are on the same page with the Supreme Court? We found that the Lodha panel was accommodating enough before any review petition or curative petition. They were okay with the fact that advertising in between in the cricket match. Now, remember, they had said this advertising must stop.
Right.
Well, they took their words back and said, no, in the interest of cricket, in the interest of broadcasters, commentators, the public watching TV, of propagating the game, improving the game, they took that back. I believe that this business of the 5 selectors versus 3 selectors, I for one have said for 40 years that 5 selectors is a fantastic idea, because the different regions, every selector can go to the different areas and spot talent. Yeah. But they wanted to get this three selectors in. I believe that if they had gone to the Lodha Commission and said that this is the reason we want it, we want a team to be selected. There are 13 test matches this year end, and we want it done. They may have listened to it. Instead, they started talking about review petition, curative petition, Markandeya Karju. Now, if you take that attitude, if you take panga with the Supreme Court of this country, they will hit back. Today, absolutely. I believe that not all the recommendations are necessary. Not all 70-year-olds are senile. Right. But the Supreme Court in its wisdom has said a few things. Now, for the first thing, as Mr. Gavaskar was mentioning, as Aakash was mentioning, the fact remains that they gave the impression that they were agreeing with it. Right. In fact, the Calcutta, certainly Cricket Association of Bengal postponed its elections, and it looked like everything was coming on. But then again, something has gone wrong.
All right, just enough time to squeeze in one last question. Want to go across to Mr. Gavaskar for that. Mr. Gavaskar, the BCCI top brass itself is being threatened right now by the Supreme Court. Justice Lodha himself wants that the president of the secretary to be removed and a panel of administrators to be brought in. Would you say that the entire situation is becoming quite ugly?
Well, yeah, you have to say that it is becoming a little bit difficult because if the whole the top brass is removed, then who is going to take the cricket board forward? There is a busy season ahead. We've got by the time that decision is taken, 3 test matches will be over. 2 test matches will probably be over, and so for the 11 test matches that are there, the domestic calendar that is there, who is going to be taking over and running the game? And that is going to be the question that is on everybody's minds, including mine.
Right. Of course, the million-dollar question at this point in time is what exactly will happen on the 6th of October when the Supreme Court hears the matter again. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Aakash Chopra, Mr. Kishore Bhimani and Mr. Sunil Gavaskar. Good to have you all here together on NDTV.